I'm going to tell you about an experience that happened to me while working as a trailer operator, or a profession that I'm the first in my family to do. Before being in the company I'm currently in, I was in another company that makes trips throughout California. Normally, I always had to do a route at dawn. This option had a small setback that made me take longer than normal, making me check in at 10 in the morning. It was too late for a route that I had left to do since I was going from San Francisco to Eureka, California. That had me very stressed because on top of that I had another delay. It turns out that there was a lot of traffic, which really seems very strange to me because it was the entrance to one of the towns where there was almost no traffic. After about 20 or 25 minutes I decided to get out of the truck, to ask why the traffic wasn't moving, observing that other impatient drivers got out of their vehicles, some out of curiosity and others apparently to talk. I approached a man who already looked very grown up, and with what English I know, I greeted him and asked him if he knew what was going on. He then told me to look ahead a few steps further, and I saw that there were many police cars blocking the road. I went back and asked him if he knew what had happened, and he told me that he had heard on his car radio that apparently a girl had stolen a vehicle. The police were chasing her, and when she saw herself cornered, she got out into the bush, but since there was no escape, she ended up taking her own life when she found out all this. I gave him the steps. He got back in the truck, made a call to my boss, got a little upset because it was too late, and given everything that was going on, the loading had to be postponed until the next day. It should be mentioned that it was only one lane. I, being a small town, had no major needs. That's where all the paranormal started. I looked at the clock on the truck's dashboard and it read 3:25 in the morning, a mile before checking in at that point. The lights on the truck began to blink in a very strange way. Honestly, I didn't want to think about anything bad because it's dark on that road at that time of the morning. Adam or injured and get out to check what was going on. I continued my route and the fog was very thick, which was normal on that mountain road, but everything was still uneventful. For this, I always call my girlfriend Carla on the phone. At that moment I picked up the cell phone and I had no signal. I was left alone, literally disconnected, even though it seems like something normal and in a mountain road. It had never happened to me any of the many times I had taken that same road, or at least never at that point. It was something that turned me on a bit, reading you just when I put down the cell phone. The light of the truck went out completely and the radio began to emit a very loud static. I changed the frequency, but on all the channels I heard the same thing. Just at that moment I arrived at the place where the girl had died, and on the radio a murmur began to be heard that after a few seconds can be understood. A voice is heard. I heard a female voice saying to me, "Can you hear me? Help me please." That was heard for several seconds along with the lights of the truck that began to flash. That had me on the edge of reason, and I took with one hand the rosary that I always carried in the truck, which my girlfriend had given me, and the only thing I managed to say was, "Lord, take care of me please." After a mile further on, everything returned to normal. The light of the unit returned and the radio no longer had static. Little by little I calmed down from feeling that I was going to stop in a town that was much further ahead. When I arrived, I stopped for a few minutes because I could not stay parked for a long time, but these few minutes somehow helped me cleanse. I took a breath. I began to think about what had happened moments before. I looked at the clock again, and when it reached 5 in the morning, 2 hours had passed, and the truth is that for me it was only a couple of seconds. I continued my trip and I finally reached my destination, and of course I had to return by the same route, but during the day, although the next times I had that to get through, I had to do it at dawn, of course, and I always asked God not to let that happen to me again. After 2 months, I resigned from that company. I am still a truck driver, but the routes we make here are almost all local and the atmosphere is really much calmer. But yes, I will never forget that early morning of my life which I spent in that red Peterbilt. I pruned it with much love. The bird, the nephew, works in a company that sells merchandise. On a certain delivery very early in the morning they arrived. In the state of Mexico, on the side of the Costa Barbadas highway, they settled under a large tree and he went to the cabin with one of his porters, while the co-pilot and the driver fell asleep in the cabin. The two spaces were connected, and so my nephew began to dream that a woman approached his truck window. She told them to get out of there because they were stealing the load, and he even felt how the truck was moving. He says that the woman had elongated features with very large eyes, a very flaccid chest in. That woke him up, but he didn't give it any importance, so he went back to sleep. Only this time he felt that for him it is like seeing a dream, and then he began to contract his body so that this wouldn't happen. When he turned around, he noticed that the porter was doing the same thing. They both woke up and the porter said to him, "Don't worry, the dead guy wants to get on me." He replied that, just like they were throwing it at each other. At that moment, the driver and the co-pilot also woke up and told them that they were. A woman told him to leave and that Although the dreams were not identical, they were quite similar. For that reason they decided to leave immediately. A few months later there were 3 crosses in that place, under that tree where they had stayed that night. Apparently those people did not have the same luck. Approximately 2 months ago, I went to Ciudad Victoria, Tamaulipas. I was coming from Hermosillo, Sonora. Before having that life that had befallen me, I rested for 2 days since the Ford Hermosillo plant had a technical stoppage and all. The trailers that I would take to Tamaulipas were not yet ready. For that reason I was rested to begin the trip. I arrived at the yard of the transport company and I already had my trailer along with the papers ready, so it was time to begin my trip. This time it was my turn to make a decision. I couldn't go in convoy because the other colleagues' boxes weren't ready and they were still waiting for their turn to leave. I crossed Sonora, Sinaloa, Durango and Zacatecas without any incident, and as always the night was a nightmare on the road, this time in San Luis Potosí, which luckily my colleagues had told me about. At the exit of San Luis Potosí, on the road that connects with Ciudad Mante, Tamaulipas, was quite high in crime, and on that stretch of road they stole loads. There were no truck drivers, but my eyes were already closing from tiredness, so I started to look for public places where I could sleep for a while. I arrived at a gas station in Convention to be able to rest, but when it came time to be there I didn't feel comfortable at all, since there was a woman offering her services and she wouldn't let me rest because she was knocking on the door of the cabin every so often. Since I didn't agree, that's why she insisted that I let her in. So I got back on track, retreated from the site miles ahead, from a quiet spot against a small town, disregarding the warnings of my colleagues and somewhat neglecting my safety. Mark and Jay now so the unit could see it, traffic on the hot spot, a little food. Then I lay down to watch TV, later I fell fast asleep. I was asleep for about 2 hours when I started to feel violent movements in the truck. I got out of my bed excited and confused and did not understand what was happening. For a moment I thought it was a dream, but it was not. In reality the truck was shaking violently. Crossing the cabin, I turned on the exterior lights and, thinking that perhaps it was a robbery, I took my house and, armed with a baseball bat, I opened the curtains that were covering the windshield of the unit, but what was my surprise that there was nothing in front of the unit and nothing could be seen on the sides either, but Zoes and the unit continued to move from one side to the other. I thought that perhaps he was trying to open the tank to steal the fuel, so I returned to the cabin to check the rear side. I moved the curtain and, with horror, I could see that what was moving the trailer was a humanoid-looking being about 2 meters tall. With the little light that enters the rooms, I could see that this being was covered in a kind of hair. Said creature was swinging the vehicle at the same time that it emitted a screech similar to that of a pig. Seeing this creature, I panicked, and so, in my night clothes, I turned on the unit, but faced the option of the horn to try and scare it away, but to no avail. As I continued to try to turn the unit on, this thing kept banging on the box. When the gear finally showed itself, it tried to climb onto the step, but shortly after climbing on, it came loose as the mirror structure. I have rearview mirrors and climbing mirrors that it has precisely because of the crime that plagues the roads. A few meters ahead, I realized that this creature was still behind me, advancing with long and clumsy steps. All this while it was screaming in a frightening way. In my desperation, I increased my speed and prayed to the gods, to Michael the Archangel, since I did not want anything to happen to me in this situation, and as the truck advanced, the creature was falling further and further behind. I continued my loving journey through Tamaulipas and arrived. A hookah and a coffee to get over the fright. I am used to experiencing paranormal situations, as I had mentioned in the second compilation of apparitions on the road. I consider myself sensitive to them, but there are very few times that I have experiences with creatures of this type. Finishing my coffee, I continued on my way, and a couple of kilometers later I had to stop at the first gas station to rest, since I was still sleepy. This story didn't happen to me on the road, but it is paranormal and dates back to 2012. Around that time I was just starting out in this trucking environment. Years ago I had a job as a driver. I was even able to be a driver in the army, so I really liked that job and decided to focus on this branch this time. And it is a trip that you can't miss, Hermosillo, Sonora, and you are going to transport imported components from a company assembly plant, so I left at places like 8 at night. The road was somewhat lonely since it was raining and it was very ugly. I was driving slowly out of caution, and in fact I made some stops on stretches of the road since the asphalt was very wet. I arrived at the assembly plant in Hermosillo at about 2 in the morning. I showed up at the booth of the ropes of that assembly plant, exhausted, which caused me a bit of concern that morning. I saw a somewhat strange woman. She was wearing dirty clothes and her skin was light, but something was strange because it was creamy in color, or at least that was what I was perceiving. The same booth. So that before it was supposed to be to sleep a little or perhaps to have a better vision at night. The only thing that was illuminating that night was a public street lamp. My concern arose because as much as I tried to see the face of that woman, surprisingly I could not. Somehow, the darkness was confused among her loose hair. "Good morning, locally imported material," I said, but she did not answer me. For a moment I thought she was rude, that she did not greet me, but then I thought that perhaps she was still asleep, since the work of guarding security takes many hours and is hard for them. Anyway, I handed over my papers and asked her where she left the load, and with a hissing voice she answered me, "Station's in front, I have the ramps occupied right now." After that, I said goodbye to that strange woman, got into my trailer and started it up. I parked right where she had indicated, since I was blocking traffic. After that, I got ready to sleep for a while she called me to unload. While I was sleeping, they knocked on the truck door and asked me what I was killing time, standing in front of the plant, that they urgently needed the material I was carrying and that I should immediately go to ramp on one of the platforms that were available. Then I told the coward that they had told me that there were no ramps to unload, and he only answered me, "Maybe the ramp, and we'll talk now, since your shipment is urgent for that." When I checked my cell phone, I already had several missed calls from the boss, perhaps to let me know that this material was urgent. I went to the platform area to ramp it. And once inside the facilities of that maquiladora, he approached me to the security room, asked me again for the cargo documents to stamp them, and I told him that the lady from the little house had already received them and that they were there now. At that moment, the guard turned to look at me with a face of astonishment and some fear. He asked me, "Which guard are you referring to, the one in the first booth?" I answered, "That's strange, there is no one in this booth, in fact it has not been used for some time. If you want, we will check." Go for those papers that I told him. Even that person, maybe he is an introvert, or maybe he called the other colleagues so as not to go alone. He may be armed and with more people, since he is not the first to try the facilities after a few minutes and with the pickup patrol of the security company 4 blocks up. They told us of his progress. Let's see if that woman is there, and at the same time we will see what happened with the cargo papers. At that moment, what interested me was to recover those papers now. That without them they wouldn't pay for my trip. In addition to my boss's scolding, we arrived at the crossroads and there was nothing, and the others, who? They went to check the periphery of the maquiladora to see if they could find any suspicious person. The latecomer inside the booth, I realized that the cargo papers were lying on the floor. The guard who had accompanied me at that moment said to me, "Guerra, again doing the showers. What's wrong, boss? What's going on?" I asked. "You'll find out who helped you soon," our colleagues told him. He said there was nothing new and received the same response from his other colleagues. For the same reason they told him they were going to get us at the booth. The guard told the driver to leave the 2 of us in the monitoring room to check the cameras at that moment. The guard told me, "I'm going to show you who you gave the papers to." I was a bit surprised, I didn't know what was happening, I felt a bit confused, and I told myself that there is always something strange about that woman. Anyway, we got to the monitoring room and the guard told the girl who was checking the cameras that she wanted the view of the camera of the abandoned booth, asked her to go back to the video, and what they showed me next made my skin crawl. In the security video it clearly showed you when she checked the security booth and I approached the window, but I was only talking to myself in that place. Seconds later you see him handing over the papers, but it is rough on the floor, and then you see a shadow on the window of the booth. Later you see me when I leave. There the guard told me the following, "Look, comrade, don't be scared by the person who helped you. He is a person who died a long time ago, they called him La Correzza. He already worked in the maquiladora in the production area and died of a heart attack. Since then he does his thing and appears in the bathrooms. I whispered things to the production people and the offices turn off the lights and sometimes the booths appear. And in fact he is not the first driver to whom he appears. On one occasion he also received the papers from a driver. He even signed them there, if I don't know where, because we found the papers for the load since the driver had his name in scribbles, but yes, the name of the leather was perfectly distinguishable." After telling me that, a shiver ran down my spine, and I thanked the security guard for the explanation he had given me and especially for helping me get my papers back. They are waiting for me to unload them in the morning. I don't know if it's beauty or not, but Ale went to sleep at my house. I must confess that I couldn't sleep all day, and I had nightmares with that woman and even had sleep paralysis with that personification. Several days later he stopped feeling that strange sensation that someone was watching me, and little by little everything went back to normal. These experiences correspond to the same person who shared with us the second compilation of apparitions on the road. If you want to know more anecdotes about him, I will leave you the link in the description of the video. I am a 28-year-old young man, a truck driver for about 3-6 months ago. My boss sent me to Bogota, so the next day I left my job at midnight. I was going with the order that I had to deliver to the FedEx offices. The cold silence of the early morning passed, accompanied by my favorite Pink Floyd CD. It was about 2 a.m. when I stopped to stretch my legs for a couple of minutes. It was a bit cloudy, so my visibility was a bit limited, but in the middle of the narrow field in front of me I saw something that made my blood run cold and said with two. It was a kind of pale gray, hairless humanoid eating a cow in front of me. Despite the fog, I could clearly see the said creature. I can say that what stood out the most about that thing were its crimson eyes. They were practically like fire. Then, the creature stared at me with its bloody mouth, fixing the bleeding cow in the pasture. I froze, unable to move even my fingers. It was the most torturous and longest 4 seconds of my entire life. I started to pray mentally as my mouth was shaking non-stop and, suddenly, whatever that thing was stopped seeing me physically and the fog slowly disappeared. After feeling free of fear, I sat down, got into my truck and started without looking back. It was 5 in the morning. An hour had already passed since that incident, but the only thing on my mind at that moment was to know what it could have been that I had seen and what would have happened if that thing had attacked me. After 4 hours, which seemed like a long time to me, I came to a gas station where I found some. My coworkers eat breakfast when it is made and it contains experience and facts, but none of them gave me a logical or any kind of explanation. 2 weeks before, I can be reborn and dedicate myself to Uber with the hope of not going through this type of experience again. From now on, I no longer do rides after 12 at night, and I also do not go out in the early hours of the morning for any reason, and there has not been a day in my life that I do not wonder what happened that morning on that farm.